it looks like maybe that will be a more lasting victory than some of the other victories that have happened. But as anybody know who's followed that project or so many of these destructive projects, it's like a Frankenstein monster, right? It keeps coming back again and again and again. And one of the characteristics of so much of the environmental movement is that our victories are temporary. So even if we get an area protected, or we stop a destructive project, we stop a pipeline, we stop something like that, we're all really happy, we're excited about this victory that we've got. And then they change the rules on us. They change the laws. Suddenly we get a new presidential administration. Something changes, and what we thought was a solid victory is suddenly precarious. The situation is dangerous again, right? And we're seeing that with the rolling back of all these regulations. The Trump administration just announced some more rollbacks on air pollution rules and pretty much shut down the EPA during the coronavirus thing here. And so we see this situation where our victories are somewhat temporary often. But then when we do lose, those losses are usually pretty permanent. Like the expansions of Las Vegas that have happened so far, the urban sprawl that's already extended out into the desert there, or here where I live in Oregon, we can talk about the expansion of urbanization. We can talk about the conversion of old growth forest into these monocrop plantation forests, which aren't really even forests. They're like agriculture. It's a form of agriculture. And if you're far away in a car, it looks like, oh, this pretty green forest. But you get up close and you walk in it and you realize this is a monocrop plantation. There's no biodiversity here. There's no wildlife. There's no native vegetation and lush biodiversity to this place. This is like a cornfield essentially for forests, and that's what so much of the forests are like here in a place like Oregon. And of course, when you have that situation, you're not going to get back to a real old growth forest for hundreds of years, thousands of years. I mean, even if those trees grow up and get to be 1,000 years old, that's an old growth forest is often generations old, and you not only have the living trees, you have these old dead trees. And so our losses are so often permanent like that. And that's what we're seeing with global warming and climate change too, is that, the greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere today, they're going to be in the atmosphere for a long time. I don't know exactly what the residence period of carbon dioxide in the air is, but I think it's either hundreds or thousands of years. Do you know the answer to that off the top of your head?
I don't.
It's a long time. It's a really long time. And some of the other gases like methane break down a little bit faster, but then they decompose into carbon dioxide, which then lasts a very long time. So our situation is tenuous in that sense. We're in a defensive position on the environmental movement. And we've been in this defensive position for a long time. I think of it like a retreat. We're in sort of a steady running retreat in the environmental movement that's been going on for really, I mean, if you look at the truth of it, it's been going on for probably hundreds of years. I mean, these aren't new trends. We've been seeing this sort of steady decline in biodiversity, in forests, in the health of the oceans, in all of these different issues for a long time now. It's not just a modern phenomenon. And, that I think that leads some people to say, oh, humans are just evil. We're just a disease on the planet and we just all need to die off. But that is simplistic. That ignores the fact that there are plenty of human cultures that have lived sustainably for a really long time. I mean, you talk about the Aborigines, for example. They lived in Australia for 40,000 years or something like that. And, they, like any keystone species, like any large predator coming into an environment, they displaced some animals. They had an impact when they first got there, but then they basically figured out how to live in balance with the place, and they lived there for 40,000 years, right? So to
the
say
population stayed the same.
right. To say that
Yeah.
humans are inherently destructive is really just to be ignorant of prehistory and human history, I think. So we're on this defensive, right? And we've been in this defensive mode for a long time. And I've been trying to figure out, and people in my community have been trying to figure out for a long time, what would an offensive environmental movement look like? What would it look like to not just keep fighting for these last wild places? We need to do that. Obviously, we need to defend the wild lands that still exist. We need to defend these few living creatures that still exist. You know, whether you're talking about an old growth forest or beautiful Mojave Desert that's facing bulldozers, you know, over the desert tortoise dens, or whether you're talking about indigenous burial grounds on and sacred sites on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, or you know, there are so many places that need defending, and not just the glamorous, you know, extremely beautiful places need defending. I mean, in my area, you know, we fought a housing development on this nearby hill, and it's, you know, if you, it's nothing particularly, you know, quote unquote special by aesthetic standards, by biodiversity standards, but it's a home for the creatures who live there. It's important for the beings who live there. Those trees, you know, they're not old growth, they're not, you know, particularly rare trees, but you know, all trees are going to be rare at the rate that we're going, right? All species are going to be rare other than humans. So, you know, we need to fight for all places, I think, at that defensive level. But again, how do we go on the offensive? What does it look like to actually turn this fight around? And that's something that I struggled with for a long time. And the conclusion that I've essentially come to is that I think we're in a situation where we need to develop a environmental movement that's revolutionary. And that's a scary word for a lot of people, but I don't think it has to be. I don't think it should be. I mean, we're here in the United States and I'm not very connected to, you know, the good old American history patriotism thing. But, you know, this country has a revolutionary tradition. Most peoples around the world have a revolutionary tradition. Your ancestors, Justin, I know you have some Irish background. Your ancestors were part of a revolutionary tradition. You know, my ancestors have been part of revolutionary traditions in the past, and most people's have. It's not. I don't think it has to be as scary as people make it out to be. A revolution just means, you know, some sort of forceful. That doesn't necessarily mean violent, but forceful changing of the status quo within the system. You know, the way that we're living now, the way that this mainstream dominant society works with its high energy, high consumption way of life, it's just not sustainable. It never has been, it never will be. It doesn't matter where the energy source comes from. If you're running this sort of high energy industrialized society, it's destroying the planet, right? It just is. Whether you're talking about the concrete, you know, on the street outside your home, or the paint on the walls, or the plastic in your light switch, you know, every consumer object essentially in this culture is destroying the planet. And again, you contrast that with societies that have lived in place and have figured out ways to live in balance with the land and live in some beautiful ways. You know, I was just in the Philippines and spent some time in a rural area out there in a village with some people, some new friends. And you know, I got to go fishing in the creek with these little boys using these probably 10, 11-year-old boys using an improvised spear gun to hunt for these freshwater fish. And you know, we were hanging out outside under this gazebo in this beautiful, very comfortable structure with benches and a table, and you know, made completely out of local indigenous fast growing materials like bamboo. I mean, it's not like it's a mystery how to make a comfortable, very very, you know, attractive dwelling place without destroying the entire planet. It's just that that's not profitable. Our culture isn't set up that way. You know, there are actually laws against the sort of sustainable building practices that we need to see in the world. You know, this culture is set up to funnel, yeah, to funnel the cash to those people at the top, and that means, you want to keep people buying, you want to keep people consuming, you don't want people to live sustainable subsistence lifestyles, because that's not profitable, frankly, if they're not in the market economy, right? So this is
So,
sort of a long rambly answer to your question, and maybe you can help me pull it back
well,
towards the direction we're going.
I think one for me that was critical is realizing, and maybe you can answer this as a question: what is left, and how much have we destroyed versus what is left, and how much more time do we have before what is left is gone as well? And so when that comes to your knowledge, when you're aware of that, what does that cause you to think that you have to do next?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just gonna plug in here because we switched to this phone because my computer wasn't working for this. So I gotta
No
plug
problem.
in here. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so what has been destroyed and what's left, right?
Right.
And how does that influence things? Yeah, I mean, I think most people don't realize how ecologically impoverished we are already. I mean, people talk about ecological collapse like it's something that happens in the future. It's not. It's something that's been happening for a long time now. I mean, where I live, across this continent, 98% of the old growth forests are gone. 98%. Like, what do you call that other than
Apocalypse.
ecological collapse? Right. Yeah. And again, you can go out there and drive through Oregon and you'll see green, you'll see trees. But what you're looking at is not a forest, it's a plantation. And similarly, I guess in a place like Nevada, you could go out into and drive into Nevada and you see these rural areas that just look beautiful and open and lots of sagebrush and creosote and these broad open valleys. But then you go out there with a biologist or somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, and you realize that most of these valleys have been hammered by cattle grazing. And most of the biodiversity of the flora has been destroyed and wiped out by chronic overgrazing, and these seasonal creeks that used to flow more often, and these springs that used to flow more often have been destroyed, or they've been channelized and put into concrete and put to some sort of human use. And then you could talk about the same thing no matter where you go. Up in the Columbia River, there used to be salmon runs that literally filled the entire river. Those are gone now. There used to be passenger pigeon flocks on the East Coast that would darken the entire sky. I mean, what would that be like to see that many birds? I can't even imagine, you know? And that's gone. I mean, same with the cod. No matter where you look, I mean, you could talk about lions and all the megafauna on the Serengeti, or you could talk about the cod fisheries and off the Great Banks in New England, Newfoundland area. Um, the wherever you go, you could talk about North Africa. The entirety of North Africa used to be heavily forested with these dense old growth forests, massive trees. That's all gone. Much of it was destroyed during the era of the Roman Empire, you know? And again, that's not to say that this is inevitable, because even though it goes back, this destructiveness goes back really far, thousands of years in some cases. There are also other cultures that didn't destroy their land. I mean, look at the Amazon rainforest, and you have thousands of indigenous communities. Few of them are left now. Many of them have been destroyed and assimilated. But you have indigenous communities who lived in balance for thousands of years. During that same period that the Romans were destroying their forest and destroying other people's forest, other people in different parts of the world were not destroying their forest. They were protecting it. They were living in balance. They figured out some good ways to live. So it's not inevitable. But
that's the
I think
way
we need,
that we live today. That's the way we're
yeah, and
going.
I think we need to recognize that level of ecological impoverishment. And it's not to say that the natural world is incredibly resilient, but it's sort of like a human body. We're very resilient too. Somebody could lose an arm, somebody can lose their legs, somebody can, have organ damage and heart attack and all these different things and still survive. But eventually you reach a state of, decompensatory shock or whatever, and you're past the point of helping, right? So the world is compensating, and we see a lot of life still in some places because life wants to live incredibly bad. And I think we see in the few places where humans do get out of the way and do stop the industrial destructive activities that are so rough on the planet, we see the natural world recover pretty quickly because life wants to live and the earth will heal itself. All we need to do is get out of the way and stop those people who won't get out of the way voluntarily. You know, you look at Chernobyl. I was just watching that new show about Chernobyl recently the other day, and one thing that they don't cover in the TV show because it just covers the events of what was it, 1986 when the meltdown happened. But you know, now the site around Chernobyl is this big exclusion zone. It's pretty large, I think thousands of square kilometers, and it's one of the most important wildlife refuges in all of Europe. And there are still some people who live in there illegally, and people go in there for other purposes. You can go in and out. You're just not supposed to live in there. So it's not like this is a human-free zone. Again, we can live in balance. We can live with other creatures on the planet. It's not just that humans were excluded, but it's that heavy industry has been excluded. You know, these sort of heavy-duty industrial activities have completely stopped within this region. And now you have this endangered horse species. The biggest herds in Europe are in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. You have multiple packs of wolves. You have wild boar. You have this incredible flourishing of wildlife. And yeah, they have a few more deformities and tumors than they would otherwise, but they're surviving despite the nuclear accident. You know, it really shows this, you know, worst nuclear catastrophe in history is actually not as bad for wildlife as is the normal functioning of industrial civilization, right? It's kind of shocking, but it's true. It's true.
True, very true. If you get people and development out of the way, then it'll come back. But how close are we, especially at the current rate of growth and development and whatnot, to being an incurable patient? Do you think?
I don't know. That's a tough question. I cut out my video there because the audio was a little stuttery and I've
Okay.
got limited data. So, but to answer your question, I don't know. You know, I don't have a crystal ball and it's hard to predict the future. People have predicted that the system is going to collapse. It's undermining its own ecological foundations. It's going to collapse. You got a lot of conspiracy theories out there and people who are ready to predict that things are about to happen. And we're seeing a lot of that happen with coronavirus right now. And, you know, I can't tell you. I do know that this system that we're living in is fragile. I think a lot of people are feeling how fragile it is right now with the coronavirus situation. People are really grappling with that in a way that they weren't a couple weeks ago. You know, people are really starting to understand, oh, we're very dependent on the grocery stores being full of food. And if they're not, then maybe I have food for a week or two or three, and then what? Um, you know, and I think those sort of supply chain fragilities are going to become increasingly apparent to people with this coronavirus situation and also just with climate change and increase in extreme weather events and so on. Excuse me. So, yeah, I think people are starting to realize how fragile this system is, and I think that's good because I think it encourages people to start thinking more locally again because we live in this system that's so globalized. You know, everything. I don't know, you know, what's around you right now, but I can just see behind you, you know, picture frames, a shelving unit or something, some sort of speaker. You know, I got same things around me here. I got Christmas lights on the wall. I've got couple pillows. You know, I've got a space heater. All of these items were shipped from probably thousands of miles away, right? And we
Yep.
live in this consumer culture that encourages this, that facilitates this, that in fact really makes it inevitable. You know, I used to think that personal change was the only way and that I needed to change all my own consumption patterns, and I still try and do that. Like I forage a lot of my own food. I hunt, I gather, I have chickens. I live in a rural area. I heat my home with wood. I use as little electricity as I can. I don't fly unnecessarily. I don't travel unnecessarily. I try to buy natural fibers, rather than buying more fleece and polyester clothing that's, just putting out millions of microparticles of plastic every time you wash it. I try to do these things, but the reality is, most people are too poor to buy organic food. Most people are too poor to buy organic cotton and wool clothing, right? So we literally do not have the choice. Most of us do not have the ability to make the choices that we know are right. And that's a situation that we're put in because of the economic system that we live under, because of capitalism, because of this situation that we live in, this political, socioeconomic situation that we live in, or that we live under, right? So I don't think personal change is really the answer to it, but I do think that this sort of crisis situation, it helps people to understand that we need to relocalize. We need to build local food systems. We need to become locally self-sufficient. And I think that is, I don't know. Do you remember, Justin, a while ago, there was this thing going around about like the 100-mile diet? It was like a type of ecological eating. People were talking about like, yeah, try and get all your foods from within 100 miles of where you live,
I
Because
haven't heard
most
of that,
most
but
often when you yeah, most often when you eat a plate of food, it contains it contains, ingredients from something, I'm making the numbers up, but 5 countries, and they've traveled an average of 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles each, right? So the idea was you localize your food and you support local farmers, again, all this stuff. But we
right,
don't
go
just need a
local.
hundred, right? We don't just need 100-mile diet. We need 100-mile everything. We need 100-mile clothing, 100-mile housing, 100-mile food, 100-mile water systems, 100-mile everything. Because when you have a localized economy, you can actually see the destruction, right? If somebody is going to mountain, maybe the people will come together and say, hey, we don't actually need that ore from that mountain. We don't need that metal. It's not necessary for us. We would rather have an intact mountain and water that's not poisoned than, some consumer goods made of this metal that comes out of this mountain. So I don't know. I don't know exactly what the future holds in terms of collapse and how things are going to play out, but I do know that things are getting worse, and they're getting worse more and more quickly. Every year carbon emissions are higher than the year before. So the rate of destruction is accelerating. The curve is getting steeper and steeper, right? And that's true whether you look at, carbon emissions or rates of pollution, plastic production, various forms of toxins, um, oceanic dead zones, acidification of the oceans, deforestation, species extinction. And then, we're going to see increasingly the impacts of this on people in terms of, you know, um, refugee crises, food shortages, water shortages. We're already seeing this. Um, I'm speaking on a panel on Thursday, virtual panel, with Christian Parenti, who is a journalist who wrote a book called Tropic of Chaos, which is all about how essentially we're already seeing all of these wars and instabilities triggered by environmental catastrophes and climate change. And often it's not the only trigger. There's underlying tensions or there's other issues, but it's exacerbating everything. It's making it all worse, right? And that's only going to continue. So, to me, we don't really have a total choice at this point. Like those things are coming. We're entering a world that's going to be more unstable, more dangerous, hotter, drier, with less food. All these things are coming regardless of what we do. The question for me is, are we going to be able to control the ongoing destruction? Are we going to be able to stop the systems that are really accelerating us into that crisis as fast as possible? Are we going to be able to shut down the fossil fuel economy? Are we going to be able to shut down the consumption driven, extraction driven economy and really start to relocalize our food systems, relocalize our entire lives and our communities? And are we going to be able to build these alternative ways of life that can support us in this new, more unstable world going forward? I mean, the answers are out there. If you look at, you look at permaculture, you look at land restoration, you look at intentional communities around the world. I mean, people have figured out incredible low tech, non destructive solutions for restoring land, for growing food and creating sustainable human communities, even on marginal lands. They're for sustaining human health without a modern industrial pharmaceutical medical system, right? Like, I'm not saying that we can solve every problem. We There are some incredible abilities that come from this modern, scientific, high energy industrial civilization that we just won't be able to replicate under a low energy society. But the thing is, we're not going to have a choice either way. I mean, the system is going to come down. It's destroying its own foundation, and it's going to collapse at some point sooner or later. The only question is when. And I think that the sooner we make that transition to a sustainable way of life, the better. Because again, that destruction is just accelerating. Things are getting worse all the time. And it's hard for people to acknowledge that. I think people always think like some magical change is right around the corner. People like to be optimistic and like to think we'll figure it out. We'll have some technological breakthroughs. And I think people need to realize this is really the adult equivalent of wishing upon a star. There's no evidence that that's happening, right? There's no actual evidence that that is going to happen, that people are going to figure it out. And if we look at the evidence, it all shows that corporations and governments are failing completely. They're not addressing these problems in a serious way. The solutions, quote unquote, that they do propose aren't working and probably won't work if you investigate them, thoroughly. Things like green energy and all these things. I mean, you look at situations like Germany, and they've brought all this green energy online, and their carbon emissions have gone down a little bit, but many people are saying they just exported those emissions to China, which is where all their solar panels and so on are made. And they financed their entire, green energy transition, among other ways, by being one of the leading car manufacturers in the world and producing all these diesel cars that had pollution cheating devices on them so that they could get past the emissions tests illegally, right? So it's really just it's a pyramid scheme. It's a house of cards. This whole system is a house of cards, and we can't rely on these top-down answers from the politicians and the bureaucrats and the corporations. I think it needs to be the people.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was having a discussion earlier where someone was saying that these OECD countries have been reducing their resource consumption while their GDP has been growing, but they've really, a lot of that is outsourcing to other countries where they will do the environmental degradation. That just feeds into this colonial mindset. Well, we're doing really well, or we're doing better than, which isn't really well, because it's already an enormous amount of resources they're consuming. Those OECD countries use the most resources of all countries by a long shot, per person. So obviously we've established that it's really bad out there for the environment, and really the governments, like you said, aren't responding to that. And I think that's at the heart issue when we talk about an environmental movement. Is yes, people are they're pouring their hearts out into their work to try to get governments to protect places and to stop corporations from destroying places and things like that. But really, at the heart of it, what we're against is an economic and power system that isn't. I mean, the power system itself is funded and made for and by these corporations that are making enormous amounts of money doing these things, and the likelihood that they're going to just, they have the lobbyists, they pay for the campaign, the idea that they're going to just, change of heart, or that we're going to even get a tipping point in public opinion about these things enough, because they control the messaging too, right? These corporations own most of the news outlets in the country, the major ones anyways, and they have that messaging that goes up. So the likelihood that you're either even going to have a tipping point in popular opinion, these things, or that even if you did, that you would still even be able to get these governments to actually take significant action that would affect these profit margins, just seems, it's, at least for me, has come to just seem like a ridiculous idea. And so then, with that being said, Max, what do you see? What if someone wants to, like myself, interested in doing something to save this planet, to save life on this planet, particularly for all life, not just humans? Um, what should we spend our time doing? I mean, obviously, like for me, it was like we're gonna change the people who are in power. That's what I was spending my time doing, or like we're gonna change public opinion. So I would make videos. But if that's not working, then what should we spend our time doing?
Right. Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question, or should I say the living planet question,
You're supposed to have the answer. That's
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, I can give you a partial answer, but it's not going to be an easy answer, and it's
yeah,
not. This is the biggest challenge that's been faced by humanity in generations. So this is not something that we can snap our fingers and, tap our heels together and expect it to get better. This is going to take sustained, long-term, multi-generational commitment, struggle, sacrifice, discipline, effort, organizing. This is going to take a lot of work to turn this around. And the good thing is that work has already begun. It's been going on for a long time. There are a lot of people going back, again, hundreds of years. As long as the destruction has been happening, there has been resistance. There has been people fighting it and organizing against it. So, I think that one of the beautiful things is that when you start to be part of that, you are stepping into this beautiful living tradition, this history, this this incredible tapestry of amazing leaders and martyrs and beautiful poets and artists and fighters and organizers and teachers and orators
indigenous
and
people
we can all be part
worldwide.
of that. We all have to be part of that. In fact, I mean, I really look at it as this is the defining struggle of our generation. We're at this turning point right now of, the harms of this destructiveness. If you're an indigenous person, it's been really obvious for hundreds of years probably how destructive this way of life is. For many people, it's been obvious from the beginning, but increasingly, the destructiveness of this way of life, the bankruptcy of this whole modern industrial project is becoming apparent to everybody. Like I go and talk to random people, at the grocery store when I'm getting my groceries. I was at an event the other day and was talking to the guy who helped us set up the room beforehand. He was just a guy who worked at a hotel, right? Random guy I ran into. And he said, "What's your event about?" And I said, "Well, it's about the fact that the dominant culture that we live in is destroying the entire planet, and that we have to stop it by any means necessary. Otherwise, there's going to be no future for our future generations." And the guy said, he didn't even skip a beat. He said, "Yeah, I worry a lot about my children and the world that we're leaving for them to inherit." And so the thing is, like, this isn't something that's happening in the shadows of society, like that only a few people are thinking about. Like most people understand what's going on. They just have no idea what to do about it. Or they've
Right.
been completely hoodwinked by these false solutions, by all this propaganda, by all these different things, right? So, in that sense, like I said, we're at this pivotal point where it's becoming obvious to everyone that we have these very serious problems and that we need some sort of major change to solve them. what I'm trying to do is two-pronged. I think we need a movement. We need this two-pronged movement. And the first side of that movement is the restoration, the reconnection, the alternative communities, the resilience. It's the rebuilding the world that we want to see. That's the permaculture, that's the intentional communities, that's restoring the land, that's building alternative systems of local governance and justice and all of these tasks of reconciling our communities at the local level with the natural world, with the places we live. Then on the other side is the resistance. I think we need the resistance. We need to stop these industrial systems that are destroying the planet, these faceless corporations that, it almost doesn't matter who's in charge of them or who's on their board of directors. They're just like these machines that have their own momentum. They go around killing the planet and murdering and exploiting, taking whatever they can from workers, from the planet, from everyone. And they need to be stopped, right? These are sociopathic systems. These are sociopathic forms of organizing a society, and they need to be stopped. There are many different ways that you can do that. And I recommend people check out the book Deep Green Resistance, check out our website deepgreenresistance.org. The book goes into a lot of detail of examining historical resistance movements from the civil rights movement, the struggle against apartheid, the struggle for Irish independence, the struggle against the Nazis in World War II, on and on, all these different examples, trying to figure out what tactics and what strategies are effective in what kind of different situations. And that's the thing, it has to be situational. You can't just say this one tactic or this one strategy is always going to work in a million different situations, because it has to be situational. Things will work in some situations and not in others. So we need to be smart, we need to be strategic, we need to study history and learn from the present, learn from what's happening now. But for me, I think this has to be a struggle by any means necessary. And I grew up as an activist in the undoing racism community in Seattle. And I really learned my fundamentals of community organizing in this undoing racism community in the aftermath of the WTO protests in Seattle. And we were studying and learning about, the Zapatistas, and we were studying and learning about people like Malcolm X, and I think what some people forget, this culture loves to valorize Martin Luther King, who was incredible, very talented speaker, strategist. But the thing is, it takes an entire movement to change things. It's not just one person. It's not just, this one valorous individual. It's not just Rosa Parks sitting down on a bus. She had an entire organization behind her. They provided training, they provided fundraising, they provided organizing and logistical support. So when, you hear the story of somebody sat down on a bus, what you miss is the hundreds of hours of training and meetings and organizing and talking with people and getting the funds together and making sure they had the right plan in place, right? And, I think that we need to be a movement that doesn't take anything off the table, and I have talked about some pretty radical things in my days. And like I said, I think this needs to be a revolutionary struggle, because I don't think that those in power in many cases are going to give up that power willingly. I think that means we have to stop them. I think we're in a situation of planetary self-defense. And I don't say that lightly. I started as a peace organizer, as an anti-imperialist organizer. That was some of my early days as well, fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, my grandfather was a conscientious objector. So I've really grappled with this idea of violence for a long time. And I'm not somebody who is saying that we should go out there and just engage in acts of senseless violence. That's not what I'm talking about at all. But I think we need to be militant, we need to be organized, we need to be non-compromising. And I think there are plenty of situations in which, strategic use of what some people might call violence might be appropriate. I mean, look at the Dakota Access Pipeline and the sabotage against it that was committed by, two women, two Catholic workers who are very peaceful people, it must be noted, committed against this pipeline. And, two women did almost as much to slow and stop that pipeline as did tens of thousands of people protesting nonviolently against it, right? And again, that's not to say that sabotage is the best thing and we need to use that in every single situation, but it is to say that, look, we are in a life and death situation. Life on this planet is being extinguished by this culture very rapidly. We are literally changing the climate of an entire planet, right? And those in power aren't stopping it. They're accelerating into the crisis. They're putting their foot on the gas as we head for this brick wall, right? So I think we got to do what's necessary, and that's going to involve a lot of hard conversations, a lot of hard moral questions about what's justified and what's not. But I mean, again, we're headed for that world with millions or potentially billions of climate refugees, with 200 species going extinct every day already at this point. We're headed for a pretty apocalyptic, grim scenario. So, once you get into that situation, it's like, well, what do we have to do to get out of this? And let's have a real hard conversation about that. And that's what I want. That's what I want people to do. That's what I want from people who are watching this. You're asking what people can do. I think people can get involved. They can start having those serious conversations. They can stop lying to themselves and to other people about where we're at. I think it's past time to lie. I've thought about working for nonprofits and sort of getting a job in that arena, and I always balked at it just because I was like, I would have to lie to people. I would have to hide my real political thoughts and my real views about what's happening in the world. And I don't want to do that. I want to be real with people. I want to tell people exactly what I'm thinking and why. Not to force my ideas on them, but just because I'm not really into small talk. I'm trying to have some real conversations. and yeah, so I think that's the first call to all of us, is we need to find the courage to not flinch away from what's happening, to really engage with what's happening in the most serious way, and then go from there based on our own morality, our own strategic understanding, and if people are interested in what I'm doing, I'm part of that group, Deep Green Resistance, and you can get involved with us. You can check us out. There are tons of other groups out there doing great work. The point is not, join a specific group or do a certain thing. The point is, it's up to us. Like I don't feel like I was born on this planet to just sit around watching TV and kind of have a good time and then die, right? I was put here to do something. I hope other people feel that way too, right? We got work to do. And that doesn't mean you don't have fun and work your ass off all the time and, be on the grind 24/7, because that's just self-destructive ultimately, right?
Agreed.
We're human beings, we need to take care of ourselves and each other, and we all deserve to have some pleasure and have some fun and, do things that we enjoy, but we've got to temper that with the adults' maturity and wisdom and understanding that we're living in some damn serious times. And if we're not stepping up to the plate and doing something about it, then we're not living up to what the situation demands of us, I mean, I think we all need to find that level of self-respect and the honor and integrity that comes from, living a life in alignment with your values and your purpose.
It seems to me, you look at history, we see that, slavery in the United States didn't end from lobbying and peace. The Irish didn't win independence for their own people and their own country from the British by lobbying the Parliament or through peace. Sometimes,
Right.
the violence that's already occurring to indigenous people, to to people all over the world is real enough as it is. So
Yeah.
if we don't
Yeah.
do anything and we just comply with the system, then that's really an act of sort of condoning of violence in a way. So I
Complicity.
think
Yeah.
complicity. So, I think absolutely agree that I think Michael Collins said it best when I watched that movie. I'm doing a video essay on that here pretty
Mm.
soon. That he said, we have to assume the Irish state, and just start acting as if we are the Irish state. And that's what they did. They actually started acting as if they were the Irish state, that the British didn't exist, more or less. And they obviously had to deal with the British
Right.
because the British were coming in and trying to stop what they were trying to do. And so
Yeah.
I think that's kind of maybe where it starts. And
Absolutely.
the
I think that's a great example because it really comes down to, at some level, like, it is that courage, it is that integrity, it is that sense of taking yourself seriously and putting in the work yourself to do the thinking, do the analysis, do the education, the self-education and community education with other people around you, to really understand the issues, to understand the false solutions, understand the real solutions, understand where we're at and what's needed. And then, taking yourself seriously enough. That's often something that I've found on the left, is we reject, on the left, we tend to reject hierarchy, we reject leadership, we reject money, we reject a lot of these values of the dominant culture, with good reason, with very good reason, right? Because those things have been exploitative, they've been used to destroy, to control us, all these different things. And one of the consequences, I think, of that is that we've sort of fallen into this, I don't know, this sort of passive, reactive sense of organizing, or not organizing. We've fallen into this sort of strange world where all you can do is either, vote and participate in the mainstream political process, or go live on a farm in the woods, in a little cabin in the woods, and not talk to anybody ever. Like, there's no sort of middle ground where you're marrying a rejection of the mainstream political apparatus and the mainstream political processes with the serious political engagement and, organization building and logistics of political organizing. Like, we need to bring those two sides together, right? We need to bring those two sides together. And that's why I'm excited that, you're becoming more involved in this kind of work and reaching out to people in your community, because, you do have this political organizing background, and it's a great skill set to share. I think we need people from all walks of life to be involved in this work, and we all have things to bring, whether you're a teacher or a poet or a community organizer, or hell, even a cook, a janitor, a stay-at-home parent. It doesn't matter what your skills are. Like, there are ways that those skills can very concretely contribute to building a movement, building an organization, building a local resistance community. So I hope that people watching this are inspired to get off your butt and do something. Although maybe in this coronavirus age, it's stay on your butt and do something, at least for a little bit here.
Yeah, well, that's what we're doing. I mean, they kind of brought the opportunity to sit down and do this chat with you. And I'm also doing some blogging, or just putting words out there. That's what I'd like to do. And like you said, there's just different ways that people can get involved. Whatever their talents are, bring that. Just try to connect with people on, social media, Twitter, or at the Deep Green Resistance or whatever. So definitely, we appreciate you coming on today. Like I said, is there anything else you want to end with before we jump off here?
No, I really appreciate you having me on, and thanks to the people who tuned in. I'll check out the video afterwards and share it around my community as well. So yeah, thanks a lot, Justin, and really appreciate
Excellent.
you having me on the show. And yeah, glad I connected with you in the Nevada desert a couple of years ago, and looking forward to seeing you soon, hopefully. I was planning on making a trip down there to Nevada, as we talked about, sometime this spring, but we'll see. I was planning to do some organizing work down there, but I don't know if it's going to happen now. We'll see.
It's beautiful out right now. I was just out yesterday enjoying some flowers around my house, not around anyone or anything, just by myself. But it's a beautiful desert.
Yeah.
Definitely, we will probably do some more of these chats in the future. So we thank you again for watching today. We'll also be over at the Deep Green Resistance chatting with them on Thursday at 1 o'clock. So if you go to their social media, you'll see us talking about the book Deep Green Resistance. So I thought I'd throw in the plug there. It'll be on their YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you. We'll see you again. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.